discrimination. So in terms of punishing dissent, we have in my data that what I find, and a UUK study incidentally found that 11% of UCU academics, sorry, a UCU study found 11% of academics reported being disciplined or threatened with discipline for some aspect of teaching, research, or public commentary. But amongst some of my data would suggest that amongst those on the right, that small minority of 5, maybe 10% maximum who are conservative, it's 3 times as high. In the US, 1 in 3 conservative academics and PhD students has either been disciplined or threatened with discipline for teaching, research, or public commentary. On the plus side, most academics actually don't support cancel culture if that means endorsing the dismissal of academics who are doing controversial work around race and gender, only about 1 in 10. But what is revealing, unfortunately, is that about almost half don't oppose attempts to dismiss academics. So you have quite a permissive regime. You don't have many actively intolerant authoritarians, but you have a significant pool of relatively permissive academics who are willing to perhaps look the other way or not challenge this cancel culture. The other thing I find is there's significant political discrimination. 1 in 3 academics in my surveys would not hire a known leave supporter for a job. In the US and Canada, it's over 40% who wouldn't hire a known Trump supporter for a job. Previous studies and my own studies find likewise discrimination in grant applications, in journal article submissions, promotion applications runs anywhere between 20 and 50%. So against conservatives. So we have a very strong minority that is willing to discriminate against conservatives. It's not because academics are worse than anyone else or because the left is worse than the right, but when you're just, in a way, when you outnumber the other side 10 to 1, your discrimination counts a lot more than theirs. And that is more or less the bottom line. And so there's a very powerful incentive as a conservative or gender critical or non-conforming academic to keep your mouth shut. And so we see self-censorship. In Britain, it's sort of a third to a half of conservatives say they censor their research and teaching. In the US, among conservatives, it's pushing 70%. So we have a majority in North America and close to a majority in Britain that are self-censoring. So this is the whole chill effect I'm talking about. We have punishments and threats administratively, and we have discrimination from colleagues. And the combination of these two things repels conservatives and other political minorities from entering academia. And I've got surveys to show that as well, that they don't believe their politics would fit properly. And what this means is that then makes academia even more homogenous, which makes it even more repressive, which in turn repels. So you've got this spiral that has occurred, and we can see it in the ratio between left and right, which has gone from, in the social sciences and humanities in Britain and the US, but if we take the US first, about 3 to 1 in 1960, and it's about 12 to 1 now, or even up to 14 to 1. So we've got a very, very slanted professoriate as a result of a combination of chill effects, discrimination, the typing of academia as a left-wing profession. So that narrows down viewpoint diversity. And it's my contention, and it's that only external intervention can break this downward spiral. And what are the things that government, and only government really can act to change this? The universities cannot, in my view, reform themselves. The problems are not just post-2015. They go back to the late 1980s with speech codes. They go back to political correctness. The political discrimination has been going on and getting worse and worse as that ratio of left to right has been getting worse. So the first thing I would advocate, which the government took up, is a proactive application of the existing body of law on academic freedom. Instead of waiting for people to sue, the government audits and fines universities to ensure that they are in fact adhering to the law, not breaking the law. It's that simple. Second, clarifying the law to make it in a way so that academic freedom has clear priority over other duties that are often invoked by universities to trample on academic freedom. Typically equalities duties, but particularly subjective definitions of harassment and harm, such as quote unquote emotional safety, and also raising reputational damage as a reason to shut down speech. I also think, however, that we need to go even further. I think measures are needed to institutionalize a norm of non-discrimination in the administrative layers of the university, all the way down to department heads. Academics themselves can be as political as they like, but not when they are acting in an official administrative role and not in terms of official communications. Because right now, too many university departments and universities are overtly progressive and left-wing, and that actually is contributing to the chill effects. I also believe that alongside equity and diversity policies on race and gender, I think universities should have to actually show an equivalent action on political diversity, so that they should not be allowed to pursue one at the expense of the other, which is what they're doing right now. And ultimately, this gets to my final point. I think only really external intervention can break the spiral that has gripped universities in North America, perhaps even worse than here.
Thank you, Dr. Kaufman, for your introductory statements. We'd like to hear from you now, Dr. Dennis Hayes.
I want to approach this slightly differently, because I've been a campaigner for free speech and academic freedom now for 15 years. When we founded Academics for Academic Freedom, we put out a statement which was basically a free speech statement. We wanted to put free speech back at the heart of academic freedom to get academics to sign up. And since then, we've gone on to do other things. I won't list them all, but we do a lot of casework. So a lot of casework about academics who are what we contemporarily would say cancelled, but I don't agree with, I mean, broadly I agree with a lot of things Eric said, but I think there's other things behind what's going on. It's not just a conflict of ideologies. So I'm going to say 4 things about what's changed. And I think the most important one is the legislation itself. And what that tells me is that everybody now is into legislation and regulation. Basically, the people who are campaigning for academic freedom have given up. They've given up and decided they can't do anything anymore. So they're going to regulate it and trust government to regulate it for them. You know, the reports from Policy Exchange and KEO and Civitas last year all said, you know, there's this terrible situation, you know, we need to have regulation, you know, and I think it's not going to work. What's going to happen, it's going to be incredibly bureaucratic. You know, I know, because I was involved in consultations with the DFE, and you can just imagine the Office for Students will have checklists and there'll be all sorts of statements and everything will go on as normal. And you know, if you're involved in casework with defending people, it takes hours and hours of time, you know, actually defending them. And it isn't just political positions. I'll just say this, it's often just a chance comment. It's not necessarily left wing or right wing, a chance comment in chats, the use of a metaphor, a statement about something that's happened at your university can get you charged with gross misconduct. And I think you know, there's something more profound going on, and I think it's a shame. I don't think regulation will actually change anything. You know, we only have to go to the First Amendment legislation in America and the fights that still have to go on about the First Amendment. You know, it's not easy. We already have the right to put forward controversial and unpopular opinions in law. We have that. So, you know, so we have something even more, but it won't change anything. I think the second point I'm going to make is that what's really sad about all this is people have lost faith in academics and students. They've lost faith in students and academics to do anything about free speech. And I think it's a real shame, because in the preamble to the policy paper, they point out the obvious, that there is a fight back. It came into my mind first. I was talking at a panel on no platforming at Warwick in 2017. And students came up after me, and it's never happened before, and said, how can I start a free speech society? How can I defend free speech? And there's been a real shift. And I know he's here, but you know, if you give an example of what students can do, Keenan Clough at Liverpool University put forward an academic freedom manifesto. There's people doing things all over, you know, even in UCU, which is totally opposed to academic freedom. We've got Shireen Benjamin and others coming forward on academic freedom platforms. So something really good is happening. And my real worry is that that will be stifled by the legislation, and people in universities will just look to the champions, you know, and they'll do the work for you. You know, I know that happens to me. I'm sort of free speech champion in my university. If any free speech issues, they come to me. But basically, they keep the head down. But I think that my third point, and it's my view, I think the policy paper and a lot of the things that Erica said deal with symptoms, not the cause. And for what I see, there's a more fundamental change in culture. For what has happened, and I've written about it in The Dangerous Rise of Therapeutic Education and other things, we've seen the coming of a therapeutic university. Universities have reformulated themselves around what I call T2V, therapy to victims. So you get your authority by giving therapy to somebody who's a victim. So there are concerns with safetyism, which builds on from safeguarding and schools, self-esteem, resilience, happiness, well-being, mindfulness, and now mental health. All these things, universities are more concerned with these than teaching subjects. And I think, you can see it. I was a really good example. Somebody told me that one of the students came out of a tutorial and said, "Oh, that really affected my mental health." You're given a new vocabulary of vulnerability. And I will just say that it's not just that people are becoming snowflakes, which when you say that I'm vulnerable, it gives you power. You cannot be questioned. And it seems to me that in that climate, it's not just about a few people being emotionally hurt. If students are tripping off to petting zoos and it's anti-stress sessions, you're never going to be able to get them to be champions of free speech. Because all they want to do is look inward. So I do think that's a more fundamental problem, the shift towards a therapeutic ethos in universities. And if you don't challenge that, it seems to me you won't be able to engage in debate. Because if you feel hurt and vulnerable, you're going to creep into your safe space and not get involved in debate. And I do think my fourth point is there's something really positive you can do. And it's funny, you can't go around with a badge saying, I'm in favor of free speech. But what's really missing in universities and everywhere is debate. Debate and discussion. You get lectures, unlike this one, where a lot of people are going to participate. You often get 2-hour lectures or whatever, and then 2 questions. And people don't, somebody said to me, it was really old fashioned, a debate for and against. So every free speech champion could go and promote debate in every aspect of the university. And it really works. I mentioned to Air before we started that we did set up a free speech network a couple of years ago because groups were being formed spontaneously by students around the country. And in my own university, some undergraduates set up a group called Get Off the Fence. And they organized debates on all sorts of topics around the university about dyslexia, about mental health. And it really changed the atmosphere. And the Students' Union responded to it because it wasn't a student union initiative. This is coming from students. So I think it's a really exciting moment. And my worry is that this policy may not be a mistake. It'll be like a lot of other policies we have. It will certainly be approached bureaucratically. But the challenge for free speech champions here is to challenge that culture. I say challenge that therapeutic ethos and make sure that people engage in debate. And then you can take all these positive elements forward without just relying on a new bit of government legislation.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dennis Hayes. I've got lots and lots of questions. And if you have a question, please raise your hand and I will come to you. And as I said, please write comments and ask questions in the live chat. So I'm firstly going to go to you, Dr. Eric Kaufman. What do you say to those people who essentially argue that the debate about free speech and academic freedom is kind of in the kind of right-wing imagination, that it's essentially there to kind of provide cover for academics whose views have not been widely held or gained popularity on campus, to essentially be protected from criticism and reproach from students in a kind of campus climate? What do you say to that criticism?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I mean, criticism is great. I mean, if people wanted to write and contest these ideas, controversial ideas, I think people would be delighted. We would all be delighted. Political minorities would love to have that. But in fact, what we see are essentially underhanded victimhood tactics, such as trying to get people in trouble or get them fired or get events, get them threatened, whatever. I mean, I've experienced this on a number of occasions. So, I mean, essentially, I think this is a problem. But I mean, I think the larger problem is not, as I mentioned, a few no platformings as much as this wider chilling effect that affects a majority of political minorities. I mean, notably gender critical feminists and conservatives. this is thousands of academics. This is not just a few incidents. And so to claim that, oh, it's just a few no platformings is really a straw man. So I would say that it is a very dishonest argument. I mean, it's, you could say, well, look, you're in China, you can live your life as long as you don't criticize the regime ideology, you're free. I mean, what's the problem? And there's something very similar going on in university campuses. As long as you don't touch the sacred cows around race, sex, and gender, and you don't challenge those dogmas, you're fine. As soon as you drift towards that territory and challenge the regime, it's the same as in China. So again, it's a similar type of problem. It hits a small minority of people, and they claim that because that's the case, there is no crisis. I mean, it's just nonsense, really.
Well, thank you. So Dr. Dennis Hayes, so you seem to agree with Eric that there is this massive problem, and some of the examples that Dr. Calvin has been giving in terms of people being, disciplined and removed. This is a kind of very real kind of experience that academics and often students are having right now. So isn't this an urgent problem that needs something done now to kind of put a halt to it, not necessarily a kind of broader kind of cultural transition that could potentially take decades, if not something that you've written about and other people have written about decades ago? So surely this is something that needs to be done urgently, not wait for this imaginary kind of cultural change that may happen in the future.
Well, I do think one of the dangers with this policy is that free speech is now being seen as a right-wing initiative. I mean, even more so, we can and we've never had so much abuse recently since this policy came into being. But and when I was talking to the government about this, I mean, the issue is one of the main things, and I wrote about it in something called the Shadow University, taking something out of the founding document, really, of FIRE in America, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, is that there were confidentiality clauses throughout universities that means that you can't raise issues if you're censored or threatened with disciplinary action. You can't raise them because if you do, it's a further disciplinary action, and that happens to lots and lots of cases. And I think the high-profile ones are always about issues about, obviously, particularly about trans rights. I mean, we keep the banned list just to keep a track of all the sort of things that happen in universities. So no one's denying that happens. But beneath that, there is even a more worrying and secret attack on academics and all staff. I mean, it's hard to give examples. I did some work with a national newspaper to try and publicize all these things. And we got lots of stories from people, but they weren't prepared to break anonymity. Because if you break your anonymity, not only can you be disciplined and sacked, but you can be, you could, if you've got settlement, people go after you for money and legal fees. It's quite an oppressive situation going on in universities. And I think, it can be anything. And one student that I know was turned into the police, for instance, just because he knew too much about what was going on in Nigeria and with the Chibok girls and other things, because they thought he must be, he was white, by the way, but they thought he might have Islamist connections. So, and that was done confidentially a long time ago now. But there's lots of issues where anything you say, almost anything you say, people can take umbrage to and take offence to, and that's why the offence thing is really, really important. And obviously people do get offended by the topical things now, but I just know from all our casework that you're not safe what you say. Almost, it's not just I always give it as a test. I give it with our HR departments, which are a problem in this. So if you don't think there's a problem, go onto Twitter and say, I believe there are men and women, just two sexes, and see what happens to you.
Well, so then you are agreeing that the problem is then incredibly urgent and people are being expelled and even if it is anonymous. So isn't there something powerful about perhaps the government, one of the most powerful institutions in the country, making a overt statement about what this country should believe when it comes to freedom of speech? Could that not be a kind of counterweight to the kind of culture, a kind of political institution taking a much stronger position?
Well, the universities, I mean, I was often being tempted to use that because the Office for Students already had that power. I mean, as a result of the spiked free speech rankings that I was the advisor on, the idea of safe spaces came up, and Joe Johnson said he's going to give the Office for Students power to do that. And their statement about free speech on their website is actually very, very good. But what will happen is universities will just deal with it bureaucratically. I know that universities are already going to log all the things they've done to defend free speech So when the legislation comes out, there'll be a tick list of things. And if you read the legislation, we haven't got the legislation yet in the policy paper. Of course, it's only academic freedom within the law, which of course constantly expanding what's legal and illegal and what's illegal to say. But also, there's one small clause where it says it doesn't apply to all things. There will be exceptional circumstances. And I think they may have prevent in mind, but I'm not sure. So we don't know yet whether it will be effective. But given that what's happened with the REF and TEF and all the bureaucratic things that universities deal with, they'll just deal with this in a bureaucratic way.
And isn't that a very good point, Dr. Kaufman? How does this particular legislation deal with the underlying cause, such as the self-censorship? You know, if students, for example, aren't even speaking in their seminars, how does this actually address that very real sense that you can't say that?
Well, yeah, I just want to start off by saying that I really think that the kind of libertarian route is just not, it's just not going to work. I mean, I think we have to take a longer term view on this, that we've had speech codes in the US since the late 1980s, for example, you know, bias response teams of some form or another since the 90s. We've had political discrimination going on for decades. The idea that somehow there's going to be some spontaneous, I certainly very much endorse civil society movements. I mean, I think we've got to do both. You've got to build the free speech culture, but to sacrifice another generation of political minorities to just for some purity of libertarian principles, I think extremely unfair. Number one. Number two, there was an American professor who really put it best when he said, the punishment is the process. In other words, accusers are free to lob charge after charge after charge without any sort of repercussions, dragging you through these various processes. And let's say you get off every time, you may well get off every time, and you may be helped out by Dennis's organization, which is fantastic, and the Free Speech Union, which is fantastic. But the problem in a way is that in a way they've still won, because the chilling effects are entrenched. In other words, if you want to lose sleep and you want to lose months and you want to pay money, go ahead and challenge some of these dogmas, right? So the only way around it is proactive policy. So with this new government policy, and again, the OFS was staffed by people who politically didn't want to touch this issue. The second part of this will be the staffing of the OFS to get somebody in there who is proactive, and also this sort of whistleblower capacity that people can be whistleblowing on their universities. So the universities can be under much more sustained pressure in a systematic way. If it is, so I disagree with Dennis that it's going to be a tick box exercise. And I also disagree that somehow government action takes energy out of a movement. I mean, you could see with equalities, for example, where both the legislative and the grassroots movements, often radical activists, were pushing at the same time. One enables the other. And I think similarly, I don't think this will take anything away from free speech activism, but I do think it is becoming a serious justice issue. And in addition, we've got to start tackling the spiral of political discrimination as well. And I think that really will come from a much more strenuous attempt on the part of universities to ensure political neutrality and get rid of political discrimination. That is simply not existent. As it stands, universities are overtly political. They are overtly biased in their ideological leanings. That has to come to an end, or we're never going to break the spiral, really.
But isn't this really just a question of where your own personal boundaries lie? Because, I mean, would you not regard there to be some limits in terms of what research certain academics could do? And isn't it just a question of an institution has taken a decision that certain areas of research they regard as perhaps settled, or that is their particular boundary? And if you want to kind of fight for your right to research, then you could either be independent or you can look for another institution. Isn't it kind of imposing a set of boundaries on a university when it is a kind of open institution that should be relatively autonomous?
Well, institutions can be captured, and there are many situations in history where authoritarianism and threats to liberty come out of the middle layer of society, of institutions, such as universities, such as corporations, etc. And in those situations, government can actually act as a guarantor of liberty. I mean, the universities in the United States South that were segregated, for example, didn't allow Black students the opportunity to exercise their freedom. the federal government had to come in and desegregate them. And that was an example of where government can actually enable liberty. We're in a similar situation where you have a very highly well-organized group of activists who are holding the universities to ransom to some degree. They are using weaponizing taboos in order to sort of leverage their power over the academy. So yeah, I think that I really just think until you have a regulator that can sort of change the incentives to such an extent that universities will not be allowed, they can't bend to the wishes of these activists. Until that happens, it'll continue. It will just continue to happen, I would argue.
On response, I just think what's happened, the universities have been occupied by various left-wingish sort of policies. The commitment to social justice, social mobility, the promotion of critical race theory, unconscious bias training, all that sort of thing. To me, it happens within a therapeutic culture. Right? It's the sort of thing you need to give people help. That seems to be what's happening. They certainly are dominant, but the only choice you have is to stand up against them. I oppose. I mean, one of the things I've said is that in every situation where universities are involved in a training, they do it with arguments for and against it. So if you have critical race theorists or you're doing unconscious bias, do the arguments against it and try and build a culture of debate. Otherwise, it won't work. And I still think, I would say to all academics, and somebody put it as a footnote when I mentioned something about the new legislation, the best way to defend free speech is to speak up. That's what I want academics and students to do. Speak up, make public these attacks, and speak up on whatever issue you want to speak on.
I mean, I just want to say, I just think that people are human in a way. And I think what we know of human behavior is that people are not willing to, to expect people to actually defy these powerful taboos and accusations. I just don't think it's realistic. And if you look at the survey data I've got, the younger academics and PhDs are significantly less tolerant, significantly more inclined toward emotional safety. Now, we have to change that culture, but that means things are going to get worse long before they get better. And I think the public who's paying the bill for these universities has the right to tell them what values are going to be prioritized, and it's not going to be emotional safety. Now, if another government wants to campaign on emotional safety and pay that bill, that's fine. But in a democracy, the government and the law prevails. So that's how I see it.
But Eric, don't you understand why people think that this is essentially kind of politically motivated? I mean, the government is widely known for promoting the kind of counter-terrorism or counter-extremism prevent strategy, when actually they actually require academics to report students that have so-called extremist views and so on. And we're hearing now about kind of restricting the kind of right to protest and organize. Isn't this, arguably kind of give in one hand and take in the other, and actually, weaponizing a kind of climate at the moment, which seems to, anytime people talk about free speech, they get lots and lots of attention, and the government potentially is using that to capitalize on that moment for political gain. That is an argument that people put forward.
Well, you're absolutely right. There's inconsistency, and the government needs to be consistent on this issue and treat people who want to study Israel and the Middle East and other topics exactly the same way. And I think actually this framework will allow people who are falsely accused, who are prevented from doing their research by Prevent, actually to appeal that. And actually the Prevent is not as restrictive as universities are interpreting it. So it will help more scholars of the Middle East and Israel also to have their freedom. And I think that's really important. But the other thing I would say is that these middle layer type institutions, one of the charges that the government is politicizing this issue is generating a culture war. The culture war has been waged within these institutions by the left modernist activists for decades, and it's been ramping up. So the people who started and are waging this culture war are in the institutions. For example, a left-wing government like the Democrats in the US, all they have to do is nothing and just allow their activists to let rip in these institutions. The difference is that the other side actually needs, the only route they have for any kind of challenge to this is through an elected democratic government, which, by the way, is able to be scrutinized by the media in a way that is not true of committee meetings behind closed doors. So I really don't think that's, I just don't think that's a persuasive argument.
So yeah, we've got lots and lots of questions. I'm just going to ask one more question to you. Dr. Hayes, before I open to the audience. So you keep talking about, obviously, students start setting up free speech societies, people standing up and academics standing up. Obviously, I completely agree, and that's part of what the Free Speech Champions Project hopes to support and to encourage. But the reality is, that you're holding on a hope, and actually this has been a problem, as we emphasize, that has been going on for decades. What evidence do you have that will, one, occur, and two, do you have any specific things that you would say that could actually spontaneously encourage that process to happen? Because haven't we all been waiting for that for a long time?
I think it's quite new. I mean, Eric made the point that younger people are more concerned about, a bit more conformist and more concerned about their emotions. That's because they've come out of a school system which is essentially based around safeguarding and never being hurt and never being offended. And I think so. I think it's quite new, actually. I think there's a new shift, and the evidence, of our little heroes and zeros that we do. There's lots of people standing up. One girl in Oxford sets up a free speech society. This is really exciting. This is new. So that's the evidence. And I think, but the downside is that unless you recognise the therapeutic turn and the fact that people just want to self-express rather than debate, and then you'll never be able to get to the heart of the problem. And I think you can just challenge as it goes along. Academics as well. I mean, that's the real issue. I do think it's sad that you say it's not a long-term project if people start speaking up. Whereas once one person speaks up, it has a really good sort of domino effect. And you can see that happening all over in different universities. And we have correspondence in every university, and we hear of it all the time. So, I mean, the pandemic is a pause, right? That's a different situation. But I do think, come next September, I think, it'll be really fertile ground for the free speech champions to get into universities and build a culture of debate.
Thank you. So we're now going to be taking questions, and the first question is from Nastasia.
Yeah. My question was essentially around whether this introduction of policy is going to help to increase the political and viewpoint diversity. Of course, we've got to a point now where we do have a diversity of ethnic contribution, etc. But that was caused by a mix of, I assume, like some bureaucratic involvement and also some good arguments. And I think that potentially we have this bureaucratic involvement with the government policy, but there isn't a lot in there, about positive argument, effective arguments that promote free speech. I think the main ones that are proposed are around slippery slope and, values of the Enlightenment, with the latter not really being defined, and the former not really being very effective. I want to ask if you sort of have arguments for free speech that you have found particularly effective, and whether you think the free speech champion that is employed will, have these arguments be used.
Thank you, Nastasia. We'll take a few more, and then we'll go back to Dr. Hayes and Dr. Kaufman. The next question from Thomas Inns.
Hello, Dr. Kaufman. My question's for you. Given that this government has a, shall we say, mixed record on freedom of expression, especially considering the recent anti-protest bill that passed Parliament, do you think that an official appointed by a government can be truly neutral, or do you think that there will always be some bias towards the government's position?
Thank you. Daniel Sharp.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, I want to kind of echo some of those points. I mean, I just think it's quite dangerous to, leave this whole matter to government officials. Somebody mentioned the hate crime bill in Scotland in the chat, which just recently went through. This is what happens when you leave it to the whims of parliaments and government departments. I don't know what the solution is, but in terms of the positive solution, but I'm just too wary of government having that influence and control. I think it would be better if we could campaign and convince people which might be utopian, I don't know, but I think that's the better way. I don't think that giving the government that power is either desirable or useful. It's not. I don't think it's going to be very effective.
Thank you, Daniel. Nilu?
Yeah, I mean, I'm more looking for words of encouragement over in Canada, where a lot of these free speech concepts don't exist, both on a legislative level, but also socially and politically. And where I live, in the jurisdiction I'm in, conservatives don't even show up on the ballot. It's not even an option to vote for them, because it's just such a minority. And so going back to, I can't remember who said it, but we were talking about, I think it was Kaufman, about political diversity and guaranteeing political diversity and how important that is. How, and I guess for Mr. Hayes as well, how do you go about advocating for free speech when your government is very openly against it?
We'll take a couple more before we go back to Dr. Kaufman, Dr. Hayes. Chrissy Des?
Oh, hi. Yeah, okay. I want to bring up something which hasn't been mentioned yet, but I think might be quite important, which is the loss of the role of what the university is for. I mean, part of me thinks, what is so special about academics? Why is it more important to have free speech universities than anywhere else? And in a way, that's sort of the point, because lots of societies have valued the academy as something which can be outside in some way of the normal course of events. Even in medieval Europe, there was a certain way in which the universities could blaspheme. They could go beyond what was acceptable elsewhere. So that's a particular and peculiar value, I think, of universities. And what I'm concerned about is, I think that part of what's been going on is the killing of the goose that lays the golden eggs, because that, the universities having people that are completely free to debate and consider all sorts of bizarre ideas completely without without any reason other than a pure love of wisdom, the original meaning of philosophy, by the way, that can give so many brilliant advantages to society, because we don't know what they're going to be beforehand. That is why they have been valued traditionally, and that I think is being lost by the expansion and the commercialization of universities, where students are no longer students going to find out how to love wisdom, how to love knowledge, but are rather paying customers, and that's how they are seen. That's how they see themselves, and with the degrees being seen as an employment asset rather than anything else. In many ways, I think that the politics and the issues are beyond not the point of it, really. I can see how the therapeutic and the meritocratic ideal fits in with this idea, but yeah, it's a big thing. I'll just leave it at that, I think.
Thank you. And we'll take one more question and then go back to the speakers, and then we'll come back out for questions again. From Ewan Clayton.
I just wanted to ask, how would you feel it's possible to actually prove that free speech issues are going on? Obviously, it's such a subjective issue, because at the moment there's an event going on with the Cambridge Radical Feminist Union, and they are re-platforming deplatformed speakers. But a lot of the reasons that these women had their platform taken away was not because unions or the universities were actually taking away their right to speak. There was a lot of other less top-down issues for example, some of them were told that there was a safety risk to them or other people. Some of them were deplatformed because other speakers refused to speak when they were there. So I wanted to ask, how could you possibly legislate against something like this?
No, that's a really, really good point about the whole, I'm not going to share a platform with this person. So yeah, Dr. Kaufman, do you want to pick up on any of the points that have been raised?
Yeah, really, really rich set of questions. Well, the first one question about the Tories and their views on protest and prevent and other things, and I think that's absolutely right. And I think my hope is that by going in on free speech, they're going to be in a situation where they will be confronted with any of these contradictions, and the free speech side will prevail for the left as well as for the right. I actually think that will be the case, that once they go in with this legislation, it's going to put them in a position where they can't abridge free speech. Now, the other thing is, it is important to distinguish universities from non-university settings like schools and museums and public squares and so on. That is higher in universities. Now, I think it should be as high as possible in these other venues as well, by the way. But there is a special duty in universities for the protection of free speech, which doesn't occur, for example, in schools to the same degree. So academic freedom is an issue in universities in a way it is not as much of an issue in schools, where there are other considerations which have weight. In terms of this point has been brought up again, that government isn't the solution, and I really think that's wrong-headed, and I don't mind saying that. I mean, I understand the point. Government is often a threat to liberty, but in other cases, it's these intermediate institutions which pose the greatest threat to liberty, and governments can protect liberty. I mean, if you think of a school that is taken over by an Islamist network, or a police department taken over by a sort of by a corrupt mafia-linked network, again, there are situations where governments can step in to actually guarantee liberty. And I think this is one of them, in addition to the fact that, of course, the university is paying the bill. I also want to say one other thing, which is that the wider society is more liberal than the university on many of these issues. And that is one of the reasons why part of this is to allow that wider society to shape the norms inside the university. And this has occurred in the past. Cass Sunstein's book on conformity talks about where government regulation can actually show what society expects and what their norms are in places where those norms don't hold. Now, it could be, I mean, he talks about smoking and seatbelt laws, which eventually then became norms. They started out as regulations. Now, it's obviously a dicey thing. You don't want to just regulate. You have to keep it, it's not all one or all the other. I think in this case, the regulation will help to create that, will help the culture. It's not going to harm the culture. I mean, yes, some people will claim that this is a conservative thing, but if it becomes, particularly if this can become a bipartisan issue, that if Labor tries to undo some of these policies, that they take flack in the media, maybe they'll say, actually, you know what, we're going to leave this in place. It'll become a bipartisan issue. It'll help left-wing speech as well as right-wing speech. That's kind of where we want to get to. But the problem is when you have an illiberal institution that has been captured, or where you have intimidation going on from a small minority, the only way to actually guarantee individual liberty is by curtailing, in a way, you are restricting institutional autonomy in order to protect individual autonomy. And you don't want to restrict institutional autonomy more than you have to, but where they are essentially repressing individuals, then you do have to do that. There was a question on no platforming, I think, Ewan, and I'm trying to remember how would you prove the academic freedom crisis? And I think you can prove it in a lot of the surveys where you ask people, is your department a hostile climate for your beliefs? Do you self-censor? When we have sort of 8 in 10 leave voting academics that are not comfortable sharing their views with colleagues, or 9 out of 10 Trump supporting academics in the US, I mean, this is a huge problem because conversations aren't taking place that need to take place. So I think it's pretty easy to show those massive chill effects for gender critical feminist conservatives, perhaps some elements of the left that deal with Israel, that deal with Middle East issues as well.
Thank you, Dr. Kaufman. Dr. Hayes, do you want to come back on anything?
Yeah, I want to come back on the question about, well, about action really, because to me, this is a new Labour policy that we've got here. You know, one thing that New Labour taught us was that, you know, you have a bureaucratic solution to everything, you know, rather than deal with it. But what takes things forward is action. What changed things in the world is people campaigning. That's what changes things. And people rewrite history backwards. They start to say, oh, we now have this policy, but the policies come out of a lot of political action. You know, the fight for equality was fought on the streets and with people. It wasn't just somebody dreamt up a policy. You're confusing the outcome with struggle, and then you forget the struggle. There is a struggle going on. And you know, somebody made the point about what arguments are there. We should have a really good workshop actually on what arguments you can have for free speech. I mean, one of the things I always say, there's a couple of funny ones. If you don't have free speech, the point about it, if you don't allow me to criticize your views, you don't even know if your views are true. It's sort of a million point, you know, that's the foundational thing. If you don't allow your views to be criticized, you don't even understand them yourself. And you can't even hold them to be true. But there are funny ones you can use. One argument I always use is to say to people about the word but. You can always say it has a funny function, the word but, because people say, I'm in favor of free speech, and wait for the but. And what the but does, it deletes the rest of it. So you're not in favor of free speech. And that's what it means when you say I'm in favor of free speech, but you're not really in favor of free speech. And there are lots, I mean, it's good to tease out, there's lots of arguments you can use, and I think some very good one. And I think, I just don't see how, let me give you an example of how this won't work, right? In teacher education, it's dominated by student-centered approaches to education. They hate knowledge-based approaches, you know. They associate it with Gove and Gibb. Now, no one would ever be employed in a teacher education department if they promoted knowledge-based education. That's true. So I agree with Eric on that entirely. So how do you deal with it? How can you legislate for this? You have to have the argument out. You have to have the argument out, which, by the way, has happened. There are knowledge-based networks around schools that are everywhere starting to have a debate. If you don't have the debate, you know, it'll go on. They'll cover it up, as they will do. They'll cover up the curriculum that is supposed to be subject-based, and they'll go on teaching what they want because they won't have the arguments because they know they're right. So unless you have the arguments, this will just continue. You can't legislate to change an ideological view in a subject like education. You have to have the arguments.
Thank you, Dr. Hayes. So we're going to take some more questions now. Brad?
Hello, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank both speakers for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you both here, and I'm sure it won't be the last time. My question is for you, Eric. I'm sympathetic with your position. I'm a master's student in English, and I've never covered, you know, any of the greats, Joyce, Chesterton, Lawrence Wolfe, and in my opinion, it's in virtue of the fact that the curriculum has been adjusted because of political motivations. But is it a problem that certain academic departments themselves are politically biased? Surely no form of education, especially at a university level, can be completely free from ideological biases. So is it even possible to address these biases without imposing on academic freedom itself?
Thank you, Brad. Luke?
My question is for Dr. Kaufman, and Dr. Hayes already touched on this briefly, but it's mainly around the seeming contradiction in the legislation that's been introduced. I just see, as Dr. Hayes said, I see multiple layers of legislation and of bureaucracy, and I fear that what's happened is this new piece of legislation has been introduced, and it actually contradicts things like hate speech laws and Prevent and the Equalities Act. And it seems to me that it may be a more beneficial solution to actually stop repealing this legislation that's already in place rather than introducing more legislation. Do you foresee a situation where, for example, governments the government's trying to get involved in a piece of free speech, a free speech issue that's going on, and actually the university turn around and say, hang on a minute, we're only enforcing the laws that you've given us against this person. We think they may be guilty of hate speech or something like that. So do you agree with me that there's a contradiction there, and could you foresee a situation like that?
Thank you. Here's Ben.
Hi, am I unmuted? Yeah, thanks very much. It's a fascinating discussion. I just want to talk a little bit, well, just ask a question about the value of diversity, viewpoint diversity, and the chilling effect. Because, I mean, take this scenario. Supposing someone were to say, there aren't enough creationists teaching biology, or there aren't enough Holocaust deniers teaching European history. Now, nobody, I take it, would think that that was a legitimate question, because we all know the truth about young Earth creationism and Holocaust denial. Now, some of these people we're complaining about, and I share the concerns, by the way, of the speakers, will say, well, doesn't everyone know that racism is at the heart of society? Doesn't everyone know that society is profoundly misogynistic? Why should we give any more space to people who deny these things than we would to young Earth creationists or Holocaust deniers? Now, that sounds crazy, but my question really is, how do we delineate the boundaries of reasonable disagreement versus the boundaries of crazy disagreement? Because people are not going to agree about what those boundaries are. And that touches on the chilling effect. I think we all I certainly find it slightly uncomfortable to have lunch with somebody who takes a view that's radically different from mine ideologically, because you can't joke, you can't laugh, you've got to watch out what you say. So when people say, oh, conservatives can't, people don't want to have lunch with Brexiteers because they feel uncomfortable around them, that's actually quite human, feeling a bit uncomfortable around people. But the reason they feel uncomfortable around people is that those people don't think that their views are legitimate. So what we need is some agreed idea of what's a legitimate disagreement and what's not. Once we agree that we can have legitimate disagreements, we can feel more comfortable around people who disagree with us legitimately. Bit of a complex question, but anyway, thanks.
We'll take one more, then we'll go back to the speakers, and then we'll come back for another round of questions in a bit. Dylan?
Hi. My question is for, well, I guess I have an observation first and then a question. I guess I would observe first that in terms of a political or a governmental activism on behalf of free speech, I think it's worth recognizing that would probably look different in the UK versus in America. And I think that this particular issue that we've met to talk about, specifically the idea of a free speech champion, does strike me as a particularly bureaucratic answer to the problem. And that leads me to my question, which is to Dr. Kaufman, which is, does your desire for government activism or like a political ownership of the idea of free speech relate to your ideas in White Shift about how white Western ideas are not really being taken seriously or considered in the political landscape right now?
Yes, so we'll go to Dr. Hayes first.
Just on the question that was asked before about no platforming, I do think that no platforming has virtually stopped in a formal way, unless you're the director of SOAS, which is really effective with that. I think it's in these small campaigns and little groups that have started to do it. I mean, it is worth saying, of course, that students' unions are completely part of management now. They're on every committee, they're on appointments committees, they're not separate. I mean, when we did the Spike rankings, we thought, should we include the student unions? But now they're embedded in the university, they're part of management, they're not separate institutions. So one good thing in the legislation is to make them stop the spurious defense of being an independent organization and make them adopt free speech, which some universities have already done. So I think, that's one, there are some good bits that have come out of the legislation. I don't think you can just try and have some of the arguments. I mean, obviously the equalities laws, a lot of things, I don't know how they're going to work all this out in terms of any real meaningful policy. Because what do you do about hate speech? Hate speech is free speech. You should be allowed to hate, and you argue with people. And that's what speech is about. You utter what you think to be true, and then people attack you and criticize you. That's what speech is. And I just think, I don't see how they'll get around that with any rules. It's and Pia's saying, a definition won't resolve any of these issues. Where do we start with the flat Earth people, do we employ people who believe in a flat earth in universities? Well, nobody asks those sort of questions, but there are probably people who do believe in absurd things like that. So you can't have a dividing line. You have to argue it out in specific instances, because there are creationists, by the way, who teach biology and science. And the wacky views come out, but it doesn't really harm things. You can deal with them by debate. I'd rather that they were there and you can have the arguments out. It's when they conceal them. It's not self-censorship. It's literally hiding your views. I mean, if you take the Brexit one, it was really annoying. In my university, only 4 people that I could identify were Brexit supporters in an area which is 70 to 80% Brexit. The students learned very quickly from their lecturers not to speak in class. So, but I deliberately walked around and tormented the Remainers in the institution who still hate me forever for what they did. So just a bit of bottle and actually get out and say things. If you're an 18, 19-year-old at university, you should be able to provoke and not worry about what happens. And the only reason you're not going to do that is because you've been taught in school not to do that. So the challenge is just get people debating, be brave enough to stand up and just, but if you think of Freshers' Week, in a lot of universities now, they call it Welcome Week, and they're really concerned about how upset you'll be, and they stop political groups from meeting. So turn that over and get some debates going, because debate is really interesting, because free speech is problematic because it's tied with a right-wing brush now because of the legislation. But you can say, let's have debates. Nobody's going to disagree with that, and then get a real debate for and against and have a real battle. And that seems to be the way we should move forward. I keep saying that. I'm sorry about that.
Thank you, Dr. Hayes. Do you want to come back on anything, Dr. Kaufman?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I would just, again, draw this distinction between the battle of ideas, which I wholeheartedly support Dennis in. I mean, you're preaching to the converted here on the free speech culture. We have to build that free speech culture. But at the same time, we can't just sacrifice existing generations. And I think this is where we perhaps disagree, is that universities which are publicly funded, either directly or indirectly, governments oversee them. It's right and proper that there's a political debate, and that they reflect the priorities in the law and in the democracy. And the other thing too, I'd say is, yes, there are. I mean, Luke made this point about bureaucracy. The problem is there's going to be some bureaucracy operating, right? And the question is, you mentioned hate speech laws and equality laws and repeal. In a way, I think, yes, we can talk about a utopia where these things are hugely stripped down or repealed. I just think it's very difficult practically to get there right away. And I think that what's going on now is a debate over which laws take priority over which laws when they come into conflict. And this is where you need to have legal clarity that the academic freedom takes priority over the hate speech, the equality stuff, et cetera, unless there is some, you have to specify the thresholds, but really it has to be taking priority. So this is about tweaking the priority of different laws, making it clear that universities can't just make up their own laws, which tend to be biased against free speech and in favor of the therapeutic culture that Dennis talks about. Although I would add that therapeutic culture really only applies to some parts of the student population, that if you are from a group that is not historically disadvantaged, then you actually have it tougher than past generations. So there's certainly no therapy for you. But anyway, I think that this is an ideological issue. It's basically, are we going to prioritize academic freedom, or are we going to prioritize emotional safety and some kind of psychic egalitarianism? I think the government needs to make a stand reflecting the population in favor of the freedom argument. But at the same time, that doesn't take away from the need for civil society action to do the same. Well, Dylan, you made this point about UK, USA. Now, what I'd say is that in the US, obviously you saw some activity. I think it's very incoherent. You have some things which are blatantly anti-academic freedom, like Iowa going after tenure, and some of the anti-Semitism definitions that are being pushed by the Trump administration, at the same time as trying to ban critical race theory entirely out of universities. These are very kind of anti-academic freedom. But there are some good things like banning free speech zones. I think it just has to, it's probably going to be at the state level, at least for a while, but it needs to be much more coherent and much more principled than it has been. Now, you mentioned this link to white shift. Well, only insofar as the many of the forces that led to the rise of populism and polarization come from the same forces that are leading to the rise of cancel culture. That is, not being able to discuss things like immigration or grooming gangs or whatever means that the only people who will discuss them are Tommy Robinson or UKIP or whoever. And so essentially by shutting down debate, you open up space for the populist entrepreneur. So there is a link there. The more free speech is restricted, the more room there is for populists and polarization. Piers, you mentioned about creationism and standards. I think that, I think there are enough safeguards in the hiring process and in the curriculum. Students would switch out of a course that was just about creationism. But it's worth saying that there, in a way, you can be irrational and on the left, and you're fine in academia. You can talk about Afrocentrism and be fine in academia. You can't be irrational on the right. So there is clearly a double standard. I don't think those people should be in academia at all, but it's very much a slant right now.
Yeah. So what I'm seeing so far is that, on the one hand, Dennis is kind of saying, that there is a problem, but we kind of need to focus on the cultural change and get people debating. And Dr. Kaufman is saying, well, we can't sacrifice a generation. The problem is here now. And it's not one or the other. The government intervention doesn't stop the fact that we still need a kind of civil society response. I just got a quick question to Dr. Hayes. You mentioned we need to get people debating and stand up. But as we've just seen, this is incredibly hard. How do we do it in practical terms? Not just saying that, we need to do it. We all perhaps agree that we need greater debate and discussion. But how do we actually do that? And that's one question before I go back to the audience.
Well, I do think there's something, perhaps it's coming out of what Eric says. There's nothing different about the new generation. I mean, they're not snowflakes. I mean, the university treats them as snowflakes so it can control them. They control your emotions. It's a terrible situation. I agree with all the stuff about ideology, but they, by seeing you as vulnerable, they can really control you. And then you get a spurious authority by saying that you are vulnerable. So I do think that's a big issue, but it's not rocket science. I did a talk to the National Association of Scholars, and a student asked the same question. Well, what you do is you just meet with a few friends in a pub. I know we can't go to pubs yet, but in a month, and say, what shall we do? Start a society. If you want to start tackling the Students' Union, to me, you're wasting your time. Wasting your time. Sorry, Keenan, if he's still here. But just set up a group yourself. A few friends can build into a big thing. So just have some faith. And that's what I made my point about human agency, the fact that people can act and do things for themselves. But the whole of the institution says, we need to care for you, keep you in cotton wool. You can't act for yourself. And I'll just give you one example, is that the student experience, the whole university now organizes itself. It's not just a small group, Eric. The whole every university organizes the student experience for students. They used to go out and do it themselves, but now they get sucked into this thing, and half of it is therapeutic. So all you have to do, it seems to me, is just find a couple of like-minded people, or one, and see what you can do and experiment with it. Once upon a time, we could say we're going to have a picket, and I mean, one of the things that's changed, isn't it, in recent times, is all these letters. You're thinking everybody's doing an open letter against this, an open letter against that, and that's because you can't go out and demonstrate. Because normally you would have gone out and demonstrated, but now you don't. But so I think that's just an observation. But I think you can do anything. You can start a petition, do anything to start raising issues. I think. I mean, if anybody's in education, just start a debate about knowledge-based education versus student-centered education. That is a tremendous thing to do. It's not trivial. It really does change people's view. I mean, one of our debating societies is, does dyslexia exist? Where 300 or 400 students in every university diagnosed automatically as dyslexia, or I'm breaking the law by saying this, dyslexia does not exist. There's a big debate about it. So you can pick topics for debate that can really change people's perception of their own vulnerability, for instance. Do you need petting zoos and puppy farms and all this stuff that is everywhere in universities? The answer is no.
Thank you, Dr. Hayes. We're going to go to Matthew.
Hi. Yeah, so I suppose to do with the debates as well is that so I study philosophy, and we're encouraged to debate a lot, but the debates we have and the material we're often given is a left-wing view versus another left-wing view, we're never exposed to a right-wing view or a centrist view. We don't get exposed to those things. If you don't know where to look, you don't know about those ideas, because the university is spoon-feeding you a certain political viewpoint. And then also, I think, is it not a wider question of people's understanding of rights, that if as a society people have the right to freedom of expression, and to infringe that right is already breaking the law, why do you need a champion? I know that in the press release it said that it would incentivize universities and institutions and administrators to follow up on their already legally required recommendations. But if they're already breaking the law by not doing it, why do you need a champion to deal with that? If I broke the law, the police would turn up. It wouldn't be a champion that would turn up. So I guess, yeah, is it a wider understanding of rights for citizens?
Thank you, Matthew. Sam Bayliss.
Hi. I wonder if either of the speakers share my concern, perhaps, that this appointment could potentially alienate students even further away from supporting freedom of speech. You have students who are overwhelmingly certainly didn't vote Conservative in last year and do not support Boris Johnson's government. And then you have Boris Johnson's government who are going to be appointing this champion. And so I wonder whether you think, there is this chance that students would look at this figure and actually be somewhat, even more turned against supporting freedom of speech because this person wouldn't represent them. I saw, I think 3 Tory MPs in the Telegraph endorsed Calvin Robinson for the role, who's at Policy Exchange, and I think he's a buddy of Lawrence Fox at the Reclaim Party. And I know, for instance, if he were to get the job, that would infuriate so many students. And so I wonder, do you think that this appointment could risk turning students even further away from believing in freedom of speech?
Thank you, Sam. Harry McKenna. We can't hear you, Harry. Sorry. Could you say something? Yeah, we can't hear you. It's cracking up. I'll come back to you again if it.
Sorry, my.
Hello, Harry. Are you there? So we'll have to come back to you. Daniel Staten. Oh, there we go. Daniel.
Hi, everybody. Danny here. I think both of you have raised really good points, and I think you're both right in the sense that we can do both at the same time. My question to you is, isn't this problem much bigger than universities? The free speech issue and failure to engage in political debate. I worry that the Conservative government are using the universities as a scapegoat to sort of distract from the real problem, which is a really biased media, one that doesn't engage in political debate that often, and the echo chambers of social media, which a lot of young people are in those echo chambers, and at university, it seems to correlate a little bit in my head. I just wondered what your thoughts are on that. And if I could ask another question, just to be greedy. The left tends to, in my mind, group people together and put labels on them. And do you think that that's to blame for the lack of personal agency on the behalf of students?
Thank you, Dan. Anne Ferreira.
Yeah, it's a question for Dennis, really, because I really agree with the points that you're making about the fact that any action that government takes is it's not going to resolve any of the problems. We need students, we need academics to be able to organize. And I think that there's a lot of encouraging debates and so on that are being held. But I have to say, I kind of like the expressivist intent in bringing about this kind of free speech champion. I don't think it's going to be an answer to any of the things, but I do kind of like the idea of coming out and saying that free speech is important on campus. And as Eric said, you know, that campuses should represent values that are more than just those of a minority of people on campus. It's a bit like the way that I don't really go for the public honours system, but I kind of loved it when Kathleen Stock was given an OBE for the work that she's done, because it seemed to me to be a statement that, you know, even though she had been vilified, I'm a student at Sussex University, and, you know, she has been vilified on campus. It's just great to see her getting that kind of recognition. So I think what I'm thinking is that the two things need really to go side by side, and there's something that's encouraging in seeing a real line drawn that free speech is a value that in publicly funded universities needs to be accepted. And one of the reasons why I think that is particularly important is because I've been doing a lot of public speaking on a pro-choice issue. I happen to really like debating people who are not pro-choice. And so I've been doing a lot of these debates, which have been systematically driven off campus before the lockdown drove everybody off campus, because feminists, my sisters, are basically saying that abortion should be beyond debate, and it's somehow triggering for women to be exposed to these kind of debates. Here I am, former chief executive of British Pregnancy Advisory Service, being told that I can't put forward my views on campus. So by these very people who are supposed to be saying that they represent the views of people that we work with. So I think what I'm saying is that the government to actually be saying, come off it, free speech is an issue, we are not going to have people driven in this situation, is actually quite helpful, I think, even though they're not going to solve the problem.
Thank you, Anne. So we have 10 minutes left. So please, if you have a question, put your hand up in the next 5 minutes, because we'll be closing soon. Next question from Zara.
Hi, my question is really brief. So it's directed to Dr. Kaufman, and you say that we've got a culture that impedes academic freedom, and it's embedded within, you know, universities and student culture, and therefore you agree that these bureaucratic policies or measures are useful in instigating change. However, do you think that these policies, these bureaucratic measures, are therefore ephemeral? And if they are, at what point do you think we don't need a free speech champion? Or would you believe that it's going to be more like a seatbelt regulation where people just engage in free speech without thinking about it? You know, how people go in a car and put a seatbelt on without thinking about it, thus making perhaps, you know, the free speech champion position redundant.
Thank you, Zara. Josh?
I just want to say thank you both of you today for speaking to us. It's been very interesting. My question was based around how you distinguish between genuine harassment, which I think does exist and which is speech in some senses. In case of you're verbally harassing someone, how do you distinguish that from speech that might be offensive but that should be allowed in a spirit of debate, for example? So if you were, I'm thinking of examples like when women go to abortion clinics and there are people there who are, you know, what they're doing in many ways appears like harassment, and it's clearly there's like a there's a possibility that those people are harmed by that. And I see that as kind of, it's clear that it's harassment in some senses, but there is another thing where it's within a university that there's speech and debate, and about how you balance those two things between, because I don't think it's one extreme or the other. I think that's kind of too simple maybe. I think there needs to be some sort of balance, but I just want to ask what you think about that and where you would put that balance, really. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Chelsea?
Hi there, and thank you both for sharing your opinions. I think you both make some very interesting points. My usual tendency would be to agree with Dennis. I do think debate is important, and we should be encouraging people to talk about things that, you know, are touchy subjects, shall we say. But especially here in Scotland, it's becoming ever more difficult to have these conversations, especially with the new legislation that's been passed. It sort of seems to me that maybe the government should be making less legislation in terms of revoking particular legislation that's already out restricting speech. I'm aware that we should have, you know, things like protecting you from libel and defamation, and I think someone else mentioned, you know, actual genuine threatening behaviour, and calls to action, you know, such like. But I know that people are self-censoring a lot, especially, I mean, I was at university like a decade ago now, and it was already people were, you know, shutting up about certain topics. So I guess my real question is, I think you both have good points and maybe both are necessary, but how do we find a balance and how do we implement it quickly? And I thank you for your response.
Thank you, Chelsea. Short, sharp questions next, please. Ben?
Thanks, everyone. Great talks. And one thing that people haven't mentioned is this curious feature of universities, that they're so terribly snobbish. So I think what I'd really like to know is what the 24 Russell Group vice chancellors think. If we could get the 24 Russell Group VCs on side, they're the ones who are really going to drive change. And if we've lost them, then I think we're really in trouble.
Thank you, Ben. Teriyaki?
Sorry about that, just unmuting myself. Sorry. An academic friend of mine sent me the document, Higher Education, Free Speech and Academic Freedom. And I was reading it and I kept highlighting over and over again where it said that these new policies and the free speech champions would be constrained by the law. And that phrase, within the law, was just repeated over and over again. I must have highlighted it 25 times at least. And so what I was thinking was, if the law itself, the Equalities Act 2010, is so problematic, for example, it makes religion and religious belief a protected characteristic, as well as making gender identity a protected characteristic, which of course begs the question, that's the debate that we're trying to have, then, I don't see how, if we're going to have to be constrained within that law, this is really going to change anything at all.
Thank you. And last question from Thomas Inns.
Sorry to ask another question, but in this case, my question is for, I'm very sorry, I can't see your name. I asked one to Dr. Kaufman before. I'd like to ask our other guest. You've mentioned several times that universities have an overly focused on mental health and supporting students. Do you believe that universities have a duty to support their students who are suffering from mental health issues?
Okay, so yes, that's the last question, and this opportunity will be your final closing statements to both guest speakers to kind of summarize your key points and pick up on any question that in the last round of questions. So we'll go to Dr. Kaufman first.
Okay, I'll try and be quick here. I mean, one question about the law that was mentioned, You can have a law on the books, like the First Amendment in the US, and you can have 90% of university speech codes violating the law. It's not good enough just to have the law. You have to proactively actually enforce that law, or you have to sue. Suing, in my view, is suboptimal because it puts the onus on the accused. So this is where I think government action is especially necessary, is to proactively enforce the law, take away the chilling effect of having to sue. So it is about, a lot of this is just about enforcing the law. In terms of speech, a lot of this, again, is speech within the law, not some artificial notion of speech, some speech code created by the university, and the university making up its own balance of priorities. In terms of the conservative vote and whether this will alienate, this measure will alienate. Now, I think what's interesting is if you look at public opinion amongst the British population, that political or voting behavior, what you see is that 18-year-olds are about 20 points more conservative than 22-year-olds. And then you have 40-year-olds who kind of look like 18-year-olds. Now, so we're in the midst of another transition now. I'm not sure where it's going to end, but I think Generation Z, if you like, is a little bit different from the millennials, and that's just turning up in the data. So that will be interesting to watch. I mean, I think that the government actually standing up for free speech will win it support amongst a significant share of the student body who really do understand the restrictions on free speech quite well. So I actually think this could be a winner. Yes, of course, younger people tend to be less conservative, but I think the kind of huge gap that we saw with the generation that went through Brexit is no longer there at the level of the 18-year-olds. So I don't think that's as much of a worry as we think it is. But the other point I'd like to make is that ultimately, yeah, I mean, the problem underlying all of this can be traced actually back to the late 1960s, when you also had students who were intolerant and who were essentially engaging in no platforming and engaging in forms of protest that were actually violating free speech of academics. Now, that has progressively become institutionalized. So this is a scale issue with the free speech codes and the speech codes of the late 90s. This is a long-running ideological problem, which is really essentially about the kind of Marcuse repressive tolerance, this idea that if you are violating the free speech of an oppressor, that's okay. So somehow we've got to be able to overturn that ideology, which is also rooted in the sacralization of historically disadvantaged groups as sacred totems, and therefore that cannot be offended. And of course, you can step in and be offended on behalf of such groups. We have to actually eventually undo that sacralization if we're ultimately going to solve this problem. But really, the argument for the government action is that we can't wait 50 years or however long it's going to take. In a way, for fairness, we need to actually act now. And I think that can change the culture. So that's where I'm going to leave it.
Thank you, Dr. Kaufman. And your final closing statements for the evening, Dr. Hayes?
Some fantastic questions about philosophy, law, harassment. I'm not going to deal with them, but I just say on philosophy, I've gone to some lectures on free speech by philosophers, and they're always against free speech. So the solution is to read more so you can challenge your lecturers. But what I want to say in response to Anne Farady, and that there's a side, having spent years defending people's right to say things and to argue, I sort of, there's a side of me that says, great, I've said it to HR institutions, departments in various universities, I will enjoy it in a year or two's time when you're having to defend yourself against somebody who says you're not defending free speech. But what a sad world that is. It's like, there's a side of me that likes it, but it's not going to work. And I do think the crucial thing is, and this is the solution, it isn't going to take 20 years. I wrote a Times Higher article, and I thought about this, and I thought, how do we go forward? Well, if you believe in free speech, have a national debate. Because the debate about education in the 1970s, that's what you should do. If the government believe in free speech, have a national debate about academic freedom and free speech in higher education, and involve the Russell Group and everyone else. And then you will take things forward a lot faster. But they're not going to do it. Why? Because they don't really believe in it. I mean, the solution is you put it in paper, but you don't do anything about it. And interestingly, I've convinced my Vice-Chancellor to support free speech. And we've got a really short statement, which I put to the government. No bureaucratic convolutions, like 39 pages of policy procedures you have to go through before you get a speaker. It just says, we support free speech. And on external speakers, it says, we support free speech. If you want to cancel a speaker, it's so important, it goes to the governors. We don't have any speakers cancelled. We don't have issues with free speech, keep it short. So there are things you can do is to get your university to adopt very clear, short statements about policies. And on the law, just, sorry, I don't know who it was who said about, throughout that document, it says within the law. So when we wrote the AFAF statement of academic freedom, which is based around the Hillhead Amendment to the 1988 Education Act, we took out freedom of speech within the law because there are so many laws restricting that speech. So we have, freedom of speech absolutely. So, I think so. One thing you could all do, if you haven't already done it, Ben and academics or students, is sign the AFAF statement. Just go onto the AFAF website and put your name to a free speech statement, and that will take things forward. But my main point is we need that great debate. So congratulations to the free speech champions to start a debate, but we want a national debate like this.
Thank you, Dr. Hayes. And we also want a national debate, and we are hoping to facilitate that. And thank you to our amazing guest speakers. I think it's been a very, very stimulating discussion. So thank you, Dr. Kaufman, and thank you, Dr. Hayes. And thank you to everyone for attending. I hope that you enjoyed it, and we can all give a mini clap. So yes, that is it for the evening. And the debate obviously will continue. And if you haven't already, sign up to the Free Speech Network and also sign up to be a free speech champion. And we very much agree that, it has to also be starting free speech societies and debate, but also possibly some government intervention potentially. So thank you, everyone.